This video will cover chapter 4.4 of the book Spring Boot Quick Start. This chapter shows how to read HTML form fields inside the controller. This can be done with two different approaches. We can use request param annotations in order to read HTML form fields into separate input parameters of the endpoint, or we can use DTO, data transfer object, to load form fields directly into DTO. So first we will show how to load form fields by using request param annotation. So in this example, we will use Postman to input form fields. We will have three fields: name, age, and file. And file field will allow us to select a text file and upload this text file to the controller. So let's see how this can be done inside the controller. So here are the input parameters into our endpoint, which are annotated with request param annotation. This way, Spring can automatically map form fields with these input parameters. And since we are using the same name for input parameters, as the names are being used into the form, the Spring framework will automatically load these values into input parameters with the same name. These two lines show how we can access the content of the file being uploaded, and here we are constructing a result string that will contain all the values that were entered into the form. So in order to test this controller, as we have already mentioned, we will use Postman, which is capable of sending form fields. In order to use Postman to send form fields, we have to select this tab, Form Data, and here we can specify each of the fields. We can specify the field name and the field value. So we have three fields: name, age, and file, and these are their values: John, 20, and here we were able to select a text file from our computer in order to upload it. We also have to select this body tab in order to enter these fields. Once these three things have been selected, we can click send, and then this URL will be used to send these form fields to our controller, and then our controller will output this value as defined by these lines, which read input parameters into the endpoint, which are automatically loaded with the values from the form fields. For this to work, we also need to specify proper headers, which need to be multi-part form data. Headers are not visible on this image, but if you click on this tab, you should see this value. So this is how we can access form fields within controller, or more precisely within the endpoint, by using request param annotation. In the next example, instead of using Postman to generate form fields, we will create our custom form where we will be able to enter those fields. So this is how our custom HTML form would look like. And here we would be able to enter name and age of the person and then to upload a file. So first we need to create this HTML file, and in order to be able to work with that, we also need to include this Spring Boot Starter dependency timelift, which enables controller to return reference to timelift template, in our case this HTML file. So this is how our HTML file for entering form fields will look like. These are our three fields: name, age, and file. And file field needs to be of type file so that we can use it to upload a text file. We also need to create a text file which we will be uploading, and we will create this file inside the resources directory, and the custom HTML file will be created in the directory resources templates. And this is shown in this image, which shows how our final application will look like. So inside resources directory, we are creating test.txt, a file that we are uploading. And inside resources templates, we are creating custom form HTML page, which we will use to specify and upload our form fields. The code inside the controller is exactly the same as in the previous example, where we were using Postman. So here are the input parameters into our endpoint, which will be automatically populated by the form fields. Here we show how we can access the content of the uploaded file, and here we are displaying the values that we have received. The only difference between this controller and the controller in the previous example is this additional endpoint, which is used to display our custom form HTML file. So when we want to test this controller, first we go into the web browser, in this case a Google Chrome, and enter this URL. So this is our first endpoint, and this will display our HTML form with the form fields. Value returned here is interpreted by Spring Framework as the name of the HTML file that needs to be returned, and in our case this is custom form HTML file that we have created. When we click submit button on this HTML form, as defined by this line, then we will be redirected to get form data endpoint. So this is this second endpoint that then reads the input form fields and return their values. So since this endpoint is returning the actual data and not a reference to some web page, we need to add this following annotation for things to work properly. Okay, so if we want to test our application, we enter this URL, we enter data into the form fields and upload the text file, and then we press submit. This form will redirect us to the second endpoint, which will read the entered values into the form fields and display their content. And this is how our application will look like. So we have now covered these two examples where we are using request param annotation to read form fields into the endpoint input parameters, and the form fields in this example are being sent by Postman, and in this example we are creating a custom HTML page which allows us to enter these form fields. Now in the next two examples, we will load the HTTP request parameters directly into DTO. So in these two examples, we will have this additional class person DTO with these properties, and then we will use these setters to automatically populate these properties with the values of the form fields. Again, we will use Postman to actually specify these form fields and to send them to our endpoint inside the controller. So inside the controller, now we will have only this as input parameter into our endpoint, and then Spring Framework will automatically load all the form fields into properties by using these setters and by mapping setter names with equivalent form field names. Inside the controller, then we have the code that displays the content of the fields, in this case the content of the uploaded file, and here the content of the fields name and age are also displayed. So when we use Postman, we go to tab body and then tab form data, then we enter our three fields with their values and upload the text.txt file. And when we press send, this URL will be used to contact our endpoint, and our endpoint will then return following result showing the values of each of the fields. Of course, in this case, we also had to create a text file which will be uploaded inside the resources directory. So our application would look like this. We will have a single controller inside the controllers package. We will have a person DTO inside of a DTO package, and here inside of resources we will have our test.txt file, which we will choose to upload in the Postman here. And the final example is similar to the previous, but instead of using Postman to enter the field data, again here we will create a custom HTML page. This is exactly the same page as in this example. So for this example to work, we will create a custom form HTML page which allows us to enter these values. It will contain these fields, name, age, and file, and allow us to enter the values for this field. So these are these three fields: name, age, and file. And file needs to be of type file so that we can upload a file. When we press submit, our second endpoint will be called in order to read entered data. We need to create a test.txt file which will be uploaded. So this file is created in the directory resources, and our HTML will be created in the directory resources templates. This is shown in the application structure here. Under resources, we have a test.txt file, and under resources templates, we have our custom HTML file. Beside those, we have our controller and the person DTO. So the person DTO is exactly the same as in the previous example, and this endpoint in the controller is also exactly the same as in the previous example. So the only difference from the previous example concerning the controller is this additional endpoint which allows us to get our custom HTML. Now, so when this endpoint is called and it returns this custom form, since the class is annotated with a controller, this will not be returned as is. Instead, Spring Framework will try to find HTML file with this name and return that file. So this is the file that we have previously created, and which allows us to enter the form data. And this second endpoint returns the actual data, and for this to work, this endpoint needs to be annotated with response body because our controller is annotated with controller. So when we start our application, first we use this URL in order to call the first endpoint, which returns HTML file. So this is this endpoint, which returns this HTML file. Once we enter data into the form fields and choose the file to upload, we can press submit button. When we press submit button, our form will call this second endpoint, get form data, which will read the values entered into the form fields. So this is this second endpoint, which is called when we press submit in our form, and Spring Framework will then automatically load form fields into the %DTO by matching the names of the setters with the names of form fields. And then it will display following output. So again, this is the structure of our application. We have a single controller inside the controllers package. We have %DTO inside the DTO package. We have a test.txt file that is being uploaded, and we have a custom form HTML which is used to enter form fields as shown here. So in this video we have covered how to read form fields either by using request parameters, in which case we are loading each field into separate input parameter of the endpoint, or how to load them all at once automatically into %DTO.